That's better. Brilliant. I am 6'3", blondie hair, wearing navy blue. Fantastic. So lovely to be here. This is such a great day. Jenny said she was going to be doing this day on the senses, and I was really excited about it. And I just loved all the presentations today. It's exactly the space that I'm thinking in, and I've been really impressed and in awe of everyone's work, and it's brilliant to be here. So thanks a lot for the invitation. So I will take you on a little whirlwind through the senses at the Sainsbury Centre, and more broadly, how I'm interested in empowering emotions. And I will feed a little bit of what Jenny talked about into that as we go along. For those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of going, the Sainsbury Centre is a beautiful Norman Foster designed museum located on the edge of Norwich. It's big. That rectangle is basically the size of a football pitch, and then there are 3 levels with a mezzanine, a ground floor and a basement, and then in the grass coming out towards that crescent in front of you is an extended 3 underground galleries that comes round into the crescent. It's a big space, and inside we have an absolutely phenomenal art collection. It really is remarkable and extremely strong in sort of 20th century European and contemporary acquisition. We're very active in acquisition today, but also with global anthropology and archaeological art. And so what happened is Bob and Lisa Sainsbury were exceptionally cool people, and they tried to take the collection to the University of Cambridge, and the University of Cambridge said, wow, that's fantastic, that's Greco-Roman, that's really proper art. Unfortunately, the Bacons are degenerate, we're not taking them, and that's ethnic tat. We'll take a few pieces for the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And luckily, Bob and Lisa were like, what are you talking about? That isn't what art is. Art doesn't have a cultural hierarchy of quality based on where it was created. Great art is great if it speaks to you. And different art can speak to different people in different ways for any number of reasons. So they gathered together a group of people who were really visionary and got some fantastic advice from someone called Knut Jensen in Denmark, who said, just create your own museum. And the secret, listen, maybe you should close your ears to this. The secret to doing a really good museum is don't talk to anyone who works in museums. So that's what they did in the 70s, and they created a phenomenally cool museum. And they created an equal platform for all forms of art in a cultural dialogue across time and space. And the good thing for this talk is that they gave me a radical intent from the 1970s. So when the job came up as director, I was like, that is one of the only museums in the world where you can have a genuine stab at doing something radical. Because you can go to that board and say, they were properly radical in the 70s. We need to take that radicality and reinform it within the 21st century. So the way I come to senses is sort of starting in a slightly different place, which is really like what museums are actually for, right? Like why we actually have them and why they exist. So in my life, I've always worked in museums. I joined my local one in Cirencester when I was 5 years old, and I've literally worked in and around museums my whole life. I've spent a lot of my life working abroad. So I spent 6 years working in and around museums in Cuba. I've spent a year in Sri Lanka, in Australia, Easter Island, Colombia, New York. I've spent a lot of time working internationally in different forms of museums and a decade at the British Museum. And I have, in a different talk, a critique of the museum model from the 17th and 18th century that has been replicated around the world, a strong critique. And therefore, I'm interested in the idea of breaking that model and creating an alternative model for museums. And the reason I'm interested in that is because I believe strongly that museums are one of the best things in the world for activating social change. In a world where we genuinely face existential threats for the future of our species, and also an increasing cynicism in the media sources of information that people receive, and also the political structures of the world that people rely on, we need spaces where people can actually explore the big questions they have in their lives in a safe way. And museums are that, right? We aren't the authority that tells people the answer. We are the spaces that provide the inspiration, the intrigue, and the information for people to find their own answers to these big questions. And that is what museums need to do, in my view. But to do that, we have to take a bit of an existential jump, right? Because to be good museums to actually activate social change, to actually activate and change how people think, you need to really understand humans, right? And humanity. And by extension, what art actually is, right? What is this stuff we have in these galleries and museums? So stay with me and come on an existential journey for 2 seconds. So what actually are we, right? What are humans? Like, what actually is art? Despite thousands of years of philosophical and theological debate, really no one has a very clear answer, right? You all know that you're human because you were born and you were a child and you started to realize in your head that something really weird was going on, and inside you was this sort of thing, right? There was a thing inside your body. And if you're religious, you might use words like soul or spirit. And if you're more rationalist, you might use words like consciousness or an ability for self-reflective thought. It doesn't matter what word you use because we all have it and we all know we have it. And it's contained within this physical body. And you know that when this physical body dissipates and dies, this thing is going to dissipate and go. And you're trying to work out how the world works and what humanity is and what's going on. And you start to realize that other people have one of these things inside them too. And you start to formulate relationships with other human beings. And these relationships that you form inform who you are, right? They provide you with your judgments of your value systems, your aesthetics, what's right, what's wrong. You gravitate and decide upon that through those relationships you invest in. And then you amplify out your own self into the world through other ways, right? You create things, you write words, you talk to people, you create things, and that influences other people, right? That is what your role is in the world, in changing the dynamics of how people operate around you. And that is what humans are. For me, great artists, makers, and creators are people who have an ability to channel that raw aspect of human life force and physically materialize it, in the case of visual arts, through their hands onto a canvas, through their hands into clay, and actually manifest that anima within a material form. And at that moment, this thing becomes animate, right? It's actually imbued with the life force of humanity itself. And just as much as it plays an active thought in your relationship with other human beings, so too does the material world around you. So this very much heavily sits within sort of modern conceptualizations of new materialism, for people who are interested in reading more about it. But like Rosie Bradetti in the photo sort of coined that term in the late 90s, and it's probably closest related. But the key thing for this particular talk is that the idea of sort of Descartes' sort of Cartesian dualism of the soul and the body being separated out as entities, I don't believe that's true, right? I see that materiality and soul are entwined within each other, right? And you're experiencing within that body, but you can transmit that out of your body by replicating an aspect of your humanity out into that wider world. And that is what artists are actually doing. And when you realize that, it means that the matter itself, the materiality around you, has power, great power, to influence your life and change how you think. So when you hug someone, you are hugging the physical material, like you're hugging your mum or your girlfriend or your friend, but that connection that is happening in that moment is not just physical, right? It's an entirely imbued, embodied experience, right? And you're connecting yourself there, and you can't distinguish between material and immaterial. And that same thing happens for materiality itself. So when you buy a new flat and you go there and it feels slightly weird and a bit dark and a bit odd, but when you bring in your possessions into that flat, you bring your favorite chair, you bring your paintings on the wall, you bring your pictures, you surround yourself with that material, it becomes home, right? It becomes your home. It finds that familiarity with that environment. So museums have inside them the power of this materiality to directly change people's lives. And our role as museum directors and museum professionals is to find ways to actually activate that relationship in reality. So, for the purposes of time, I'm going to whisk through three big things that take an hour on their own. So, they do. One is that we changed the governance structure and everything in our museum so that we are no longer a museum that preserves, protects, and communicates the collection as the primary directive, which is pretty much what every other museum does. Our job at the Sainsbury Centre is to give these living entities contained within our walls their best lives, right? So that is written on the trustees' directive to give these living entities their best lives. A result of that is that everything in the museum starts to change once you change the primary directive of the institution. So then, a second thing I'm not going to talk about really is how the structure and shape of the actual organisation change, because everyone's roles within it then naturally transform. So ideas of curatorial and collections and learning, they're very fluid and different in the Sainsbury Centre, and we have a very different organisational structure. And then a third implication is that we don't really, what I would say in a slightly glib way, is we don't really do exhibitions on art anymore, right? Because those living entities within the space don't want to be perceived as sort of impressionist or pre-Raphaelite. They don't see themselves as being given a classificatory name that existed after they were created. They're actually imbued as a material representation of some of the most interesting individuals, movements and cultures that have ever existed on the planet. And they want to actually activate how you think about big questions of humanity. So we have a very different program where we take one question that we think anyone in society actually does want an answer to in life. And our role is to activate the relationship with these artworks in order to activate that dialogue. And then that is what actually changes how people think and how they behave. So for us, the collection is actually animate, right? So if you look at this is actually a living entity. So those are the three things I'm not going to talk about. What I am going to talk about is, like, what does this actually mean in the space, right? What is this actually, nice ideas, nice concepts, but how do you actually activate that for real in terms of a visitor experience? So when you arrive at the Sainsbury Centre front desk, you are told, we understand the collection as being alive. You're here to meet it much more like you would another person than you would an inanimate object. We've created a whole series of ways for you to develop those relationships, but ultimately it's down to you to try and open up that emotional range. You can choose between a digital, an analog, or an experiential pathway, or any combination in between, and we try to open this up as much as possible. Digital, you can hold your phone up using the Smartify app. You hold your phone up to anything on display, any work on display, and it will tell you when it was born and its life story. So all this is a good documentation project, but it gives you that biography. So just when you go into a crowd of people and you bump into people, and first thing you do is ask them questions about their life and what's going on, it gives people a pathway to forming that relationship with something that catches their eye and they want to develop a relationship with. Then in that digital realm, we have a number of different sort of experiences you can do within the digital realm, one of which is called living art. So maybe living art is particularly relevant for this particular talk. So living art, you know, you listen to the audio, it says, we understand the collection as being alive. You might well be asking yourself what on earth we're talking about. In the next 20 minutes, we'll introduce you to 10 works in the collection and try to get you to go on that journey in slightly different ways. So you'll have to come and do them, but just to give you an idea, an indication, the first one is Henry Moore's Mother and Child. So it says, you know, Bob and Lisa were really good friends with Henry Moore. Henry Moore said his first sculpture experience was rubbing oil into his mother's body, and that's why he was obsessed by the mother and child emblem and created a number of them. But what we'd like you to do is just stand in front of the sculpture and look into the mother's eyes. Look into the mother's eyes for a second, look into them deeply, and then close your own eyes, close your eyes, and try and remember the earliest memory you can of being held as a child. The earliest memory that you can remember of being held in someone's arms. And then reach out and run your hand down the back of the sculpture. And as you do so, feel the curvature of the back and the tactility of the skin and that feeling of security and protection you can have when you're held within someone's arms. Then open your eyes and look at the sculpture again and realize that art isn't a set of symbols to be translated, it's an emotional state of mind to be in. And if you can connect yourself with that right emotional state of mind, then you can connect with any work of art on display. But ultimately, it's down to you to try and find that mechanism that connects you to it in reality. So then that tour goes through 10 other works replicating very different ways of activating people's relationships. So it goes up to the Tangopuru flute, which is a Maori flute, and you hear the soundtrack of that very flute being played, and then you connect with everyone else who heard that flute being played, and it listens to all the social memories of where it was played, and you go on these little journeys. The Tang Dynasty dancers, these ceramic figures from Tang Dynasty from about 1,500 years ago. We have a video of exactly the same dance being performed today in China. And it's like, these aren't dead ceramics from 1,500 years ago in a case. They're active, dynamic representations of dance. So get your arms, put them into the position of these figures, sway your hips from side to side, feel that kinetic energy going. Remember the last time you were dancing at a party or a festival and that feeling you can get of connection with humanity when you're actually dancing, and actually activate your relationship with these ceramic dancers as a way of doing it. So I can go through these ways of doing it with each of the living art, but I'll move on. But ultimately, they're ways of getting people to activate a relationship in a fundamental way. And once you do it, you can't help but do it, right? Because this stuff is alive, right? Art is great art because it has the ability to emotionally empower you, and that is the connection. So if you form it, it's not us being like some magicians to get it to do it. It's the art doing it. We're just finding a hook into allowing it to happen. Another part of the audio is another part of that sort of digital experience is something called sharing stories. So like all of us have multiplicities to our own personality. So there's no one voice of an artwork. Art doesn't talk. It doesn't have a mouth. It's not like that. But it's alive. It doesn't talk. So therefore, we've got different voices that you can choose to hear from the work of art. So you go to the works of art, and we have a whole series of different people that we've reached out around the world to talk to so that you can choose which voice of the artwork you want to hear from. Artist, practitioner, maker, expert, academic, knowledge keeper, or someone with lived experience. And then you choose which voice you hear from, and then the artwork talks to you, but it could be like an indigenous llama herder from the Peru talking about the golden llama we have. It could be Yinka Shonibare talking about his own creation in the gallery. It could be a black NHS nurse from Norwich Hospital who's created a spoken word poem about appropriation within the museum space. They're totally different voices coming out, and we've reached out to lots and lots of different people all around the world to create that. And it empowers people to realize that there is no one right way to form a relationship with a work of art. What you're trying to do is find something that you feel that connection with, just like you do with people, and then allowing them to choose the pathway of investment they want to take in building that relationship. And it could be through practice, like making stuff and being inspired. It could be through academia, reading lots of books. It could be about the lived experience itself and actually wanting to know more about that lived experience in different ways. So lots of people don't like technology. In fact, actually, under my chair at the back, I forgot to bring them up. There's some books right underneath. There's some books. So I've got a couple of copies of this. So analog, we have a handbook. Some people don't like the technology. We've created a handbook for living art. So it's literally a handbook that you can take to any museum or gallery that you could visit in the world. And it explains the concept. And then just hand them around. They just start passing a couple of them around. And the handbook for living art basically is like a manual for how you do this. On the left-hand page, as you'll see, are like inspirational quotes from artists, from philosophers, from politicians, from different people about what life and humanity really means. And on the right-hand page are ways to access that within the gallery space, like tools to do that within the gallery space. It's not specific to the Sainsbury Centre. The idea is you go out and you can apply it to anywhere that you're going in any museum you're visiting. And it's a very interesting way. And it provides a different tool for different ways of accessing the knowledge. And also it encourages people in the gallery space to talk to each other. So we have a number of them around the gallery space. And we have lots of seating. And people sort of gather and chat and talk about it and work on those ideas. And it's the idea is, and then we also get a lot of feedback on that from our ideas for future ways of activating this, of people who write to us and then tell us, oh, what you need to do is this, this, and this. And then the third was like the hardest to come up with. It's like, how do you get people to go on what is quite a deep, like, sort of emotional experience if they don't want to read any text and they don't want any technology? So what we did is we created a glass exhibition case where you get inside the exhibition case and become the work of art. And then all the art is ex case hanging around you, looking at you. And you get in there and you start looking at all of these eyes from across space and time looking at you, and it is really weird, right? Because you can't help but project agency into them, right? You're sat there and you can't help it. You're starting to think about what they think of you, and it reverses the agency, and then you start to realize that the collection is sort of chatting amongst themselves, thinking about it. And this idea of objectification or reversal of agency is discombobulating. It feels odd. And then you're like, do I perform? Do I look serious? Because there's other people in the museum walking around, and you're feeling this sort of sense of discombobulation. And then before you go in, you're asked to write a label for yourself. So we've got museum labels that you write, and it honestly makes a mockery of museum labels, because you realize there's no way I can summarize myself in 20 words of description. And then they put them in this little box. And then you come out and you realize that museum labels, wow, they don't capture everything. And then you sort of look at like the things in cases, and then you're like feeling this discombobulation. And then you come out of that, and it's really used and interesting how people feel. And then we create spaces around the gallery, intimate spaces, where you've got this discombobulated feeling of agency, where you're putting agency within the artwork and you're feeling it. And then you're asked to share a secret with the painting that you would never tell another human being, right? There are advantages to creating relationships with art that you can't get from other human beings, right? And this is why lots of the people in this room, we love art, right? We like going to galleries and we like museums. We like our minds to wander. We like developing relationships with things. We feel that connection intimately with things. But there are advantages to what it can do for people, which is better than ways of doing it in society. And this is where it comes to asking big questions. Because if you get someone to share their innermost thought with a work of art, right, they're on the way. Right, they're on this journey of really thinking about what they are to be them, how they think about the world. And then when you can activate that relationship with different works of art from around the world, from different time periods, within a framework of a question, like how do we stop people killing each other, or how do we solve climate change, then you're activating them to really go on that journey and look at that question from different cultural perspectives, from different time periods, from different imaginations, from different inspirations. And then you've really hooked them and got them on the way. And then we have a space where you then channel your own soul and create, and then you create your own space. And just because I promised I'd send it to Jenny, are we on 5? Perfect. This is another project we launched just before Christmas, which I love. So for years, I love this idea of this living art and trying to get people to do it. And one of the ways is, I think, through soundscape, as Becky so amazingly did well, and it's brilliant. I love sound, I love emotion. So for years, I kept emailing like people at the top of Spotify who never respond. And I say, dear head of Spotify, imagine your favorite film and then take away the soundtrack. That is what an art museum's like, right? Like soundscape and music has the ability to create an emotional range and a tone in ways that other people don't. So I luckily sat at a dinner with a guy called Will Dutter, who actually worked on that National Gallery project in 2015 and now is the head of Sound and Music, which is like the main charity which sort of organises composers and musicians around the world. So together we collaborated and we put out an open call to musicians around the world to come to the Sainsbury Centre, find a work of art that spoke to them, and then compose a piece of music that actually brings that work of art to life. So it's specifically for that work. And then in the gallery, you can come in at the front desk, say, what type of music do you like? And we've got like rap, we've got classical, we've got techno, we've got jazz, we've got opera. You can choose your music and you get sent to the artwork. Or you just walk around and find the artwork, and there's a pair of headphones, and you put them on. And you're asked, don't read the label, don't need to know anything about it. All you have to do is just stand in front of the artwork and listen to this piece of music for 60 seconds. Each piece of music is only 60 seconds. And when you do it, like that exact same thing that a soundtrack does in a film activates for the art, and you really go on that emotional journey. And some of them are like techno, and some of them are like beautiful arias. And like it's so interesting how different artists and musicians, how different musicians have chosen the different artworks and captured what they see as being that aspect of its personality. And in reality, it's just like the sharing stories. There's no right or wrong piece of music, but that piece of music does bring it to life. And it allows people to activate that very much within the space. And so that's one of the musicians who's then, with the work that she did, and they came in and composed them next to the artworks, creating those works of art in the space, which was wonderful. And they are a very good way of sort of activating that relationship in the space, and particularly providing it for people who don't feel comfortable in museums. This whole living art approach is really good for people who don't normally come to museums, right? Because they come in and there are loads of ways for them to go about experiencing art, and there really isn't a right or wrong way, really, and it activates a very different type of relationship, and they can see people in the space doing odd things, then it allows them to feel more confident in that space. So that is what we have done at the Sainsbury Centre over the last 4 years, or just an aspect of it, really. But that is why I've loved today so much, because this is exactly what we're trying to do, is activate those different forms of relationships. And then you'll have to come and do it for yourself to decide. But I feel like I have to put one slide that it has like vaguely worked, just so you don't think I'm completely mad. And so it's gone really very well since the relaunch. And it relaunched in May 23. So it's been going now for a good 18 months. And anyone who's got any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thanks very much.